Okay, welcome back. So this paper, of course, is called Nutrition, Activity and Health. And we've defined nutrition in terms of being a discipline of study relating to the interaction of nutrients with our bodies. We've defined physical activity as well in terms of it being basically we're moving ourselves with muscular contraction, moving our bodies with our own muscular contractions. And we've acknowledged that both of these, nutrition and physical activity, contribute to health. And of course, they can also contribute to disease, especially the absence of sufficient physical activity. What we haven't defined is health. And it's not something that's easy to define. Ask different people and you'll get different responses, including from the same person at different times. So clearly there is going to be some subjectivity to it. There's also the issue that so much research is focused on illness, on disease, so we have often, not always, clear definitions of specific diseases and clear criteria that one has to meet to get a diagnosis. We don't have the same for health. Even in quantitative research, the healthy group is often defined by the absence of a specific diagnosis rather than by the presence of any kind of objectively measured health. That's just not very helpful, as what is defined as healthy in one study can be very different to what is defined as healthy in another, and that makes comparison difficult and sometimes actually just pointless. The World Health Organization has a definition for health that I think is intuitively appealing. Their definition from 1946 is that health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. It's inclusive, but still highly subjective and rather absolutist. It doesn't allow for any kind of spectrum of health. There's either the complete absence of disease or infirmity and something ill-defined, so the complete mental, physical, and social well-being, and you could add in spiritual if you like, emotional, that could be under mental. So an appealing definition, but not one that is going to help us a lot when we are, for example, testing the effects of a dietary approach, physical activity on health, as opposed to simply testing it in terms of treating or preventing a condition. So I was really happy when I came across a paper by Lopez-Otin and Cromer, so that's two people, it's a double whammy surname for Lopez-Otin, published in 2021 about the hallmarks of health, because I was familiar with previous publications on the hallmarks of cancer, the hallmarks of aging. But this was the first attempt I had come across to, in an objectively measurable way, define health. So something that we could use in quantitative research, which is my thing. I'm going to cover some of the key points or highlights as I see them of that paper. You are welcome to read it in its entirety. You may find it hard going in places, and others I think maybe are a little bit easier. Other parts are a bit easier to read. So you're welcome to read the whole thing. I'm going to give you what I think are the key highlights. Now, I want to be clear. This is not the final word on health. Our understanding as a community, as a species, about health and disease will continue to grow as there is new research, as there are new methods for understanding things at the higher and the lower level. And also, now that we have a paper like this, it will no doubt attract people to debate the definition, debate the criteria, think very deeply about health in a slightly new way, if you like. Now, a set of criteria sometimes themselves need to have some foundation, in other words, their own criteria. So these are, in the words of Lopez-Otin and Cromer, the criteria underpinning their 8 hallmarks of health I'm going to discuss shortly. They say that each hallmark of health should ideally fulfill the following requisites. So ideally, not necessarily. The hallmark should be associated with the healthy state. It's sort of a little bit problematic because, well, what is a healthy state? But I think it becomes clearer. Its experimental or real-life perturbation should be vastly pathogenic. It's not the easiest paper to read just in terms of the language chosen. My take on this is whether we induce something experimentally or it just happens in real life, injury, disease, for example. When it happens to these one or more of these 8 hallmarks of health, when there is a stressor, when there is a strain on that hallmark, when that gets damaged in some way, then we should see pathology, we should see disease, we should see injury. There's no point in having a hallmark of health that if you take it away, or at least you reduce it, you don't have disease. Right? To some extent, health is the absence of disease, even if that's not a complete definition. Number 3, it's experimental or medical maintenance. So in a study or in everyday practice, it doesn't necessarily need to be medical. They've used that term medical, but let's say therapeutic maintenance or restoration should have a broad pro-health activity. Right? So again, if we have a hallmark of health and we take it partly away, we couldn't work without all of these, but it's damaged in some way, it's reduced in some way, and then it's restored, then that should also be a restoration in the direction of health. And they go on to say that the set of ideal criteria, especially the third, is met to varying degrees by their hallmarks, so they don't all meet all of them. And this is the difficulty I'll just put in. A human being, let's just stick to the individual for a moment. I know we're part of a broader whole, but a human being works as a whole unit. We may very well divide the body into systems. Again, if you've done anatomy and physiology type paper, or just anatomy or even just physiology, it divides the body up. But our bodies aren't divided up. They work holistically together. And so any attempt, like these 8 hallmarks of health, to divide things up into clear compartments is not going to be fully reflective of the reality, which is holistic. Before I get to the hallmarks, I have to touch on the concept of homeostasis. This concept should be very familiar if you have done any kind of physiology paper. But for those who haven't, I'm going to use the Encyclopedia Britannica description. So any self-regulating process by which biological systems, that's us in this case, tend to maintain stability while adjusting to conditions that are optimal for survival. In concrete terms, things like blood acidity are kept tightly controlled by the body because only small changes lead to dysfunction, illness, and if we go past those small changes, they get too big, death. Right? So the consequence of being outside of whatever workable parameters something has, that might be, those parameters might be narrower for some things, like blood acidity, broader for other things, like body temperature, for example, or certain hormone levels, but stray outside those boundaries and you get disease. Stray too far and you get death. What this means is that we can use diet, physical activity, and other interventions to maintain homeostasis. We can help our bodies stay warm in a cold environment. We can help our bodies cool down in a hot environment, for example. Or we can restore. We can cool ourselves down, heat ourselves up, whatever it might be, feed ourselves. We can also challenge homeostasis with the intention of strengthening the mechanisms that underpin it. We can become more tolerant to the cold. We can become more tolerant to heat. We can become stronger through training our muscles. We can build our endurance, and so on and so forth. Right? That's really what this paper is about. And thereby, if we do it right, if we don't overdo it and don't underdo it, then we are going to support, well, not support homeostasis, we're going to challenge it in a way that makes it stronger. Right? That could be cold plunges, that could be saunas, any number of things. Now let's look at Lopez, Oteen, and Cromer's proposed hallmarks of health. They propose 3 broad components, each with 2 or 3 subcomponents for a total of 8. You can see all of them at once, but you don't need to take it all in straight away. I'm going to go through it little by little. So maintenance of homeostasis. So this is staying within functional boundaries. That's one overarching category. Response to stress is another overarching category. And spatial compartmentalization, keeping everything in its place. These will become more understandable and relatable if they're not already as I go through the individual hallmarks. Hallmark 1, which fits under spatial compartmentalization, is the integrity of barriers. Take a moment to think about barriers of the body and write down the ones you're aware of. So pause and do that before coming back. Okay. I do hope you did that, right? I do hope you did that. Without any education in anatomy or physiology, I would expect you thought of at least skin, right? Skin provides a pretty impressive barrier protecting us from chemicals, from infectious agents, to some extent from hot and cold. It also protects us from dehydration. So if you like, it's a two-way barrier. It keeps things in and it keeps things out, which I guess is what we hope a barrier would do. The more significant the damage to our skin, especially in terms of the total area that's affected, but also the severity of the damage, the more prone we are to infection, for example. Other things as well. If it's a very large area, dehydration, loss of electrolytes, and so on is a possibility. That's why burns of both a heat-based and chemical nature can be so problematic. We have other external barriers, like the mucosal linings of our gastrointestinal tract, right, what we eat with, and our airways, what we breathe with. Now, the former is required to, on the one hand, let nutrients in, but ideally keep pathogens like bacteria, but also things like harmful chemicals out, right? That's the ideal. If it did its job perfectly, it will let all the nutrients in and will keep everything we don't want out. Now, it almost never works perfectly, but it can work as well as possible, and of course then it can deteriorate. In the case of the airways, we want nice, easy exchange of oxygen in, carbon dioxide out. But we don't really want any unwanted substances or any microorganisms to be let into the body proper. Now, if you haven't had any anatomy training, you might be less aware of important, what I'll call internal barriers, especially the blood-brain barrier, which prevents many substances that are harmful to our nervous system from even entering the brain's blood supply. And now there are other parts of the nervous system that also have specialized barriers, precisely because nervous tissue is, on the one hand, very fragile, and on the other, unfortunately, blessed with very limited capacity to regenerate if damaged. I say limited, not none, but it's very limited compared to, say, the liver, right? You can, up to a point, damage the liver quite a bit, and it will just regrow and regenerate. Same for the lungs. Now, we see breakdown of these barriers in many neurological conditions, but also other conditions. I'm talking about the blood-brain barrier specifically here, or the blood-nervous system barrier. And these barriers go all the way down. So consider a barrier goes all the way down to the subcellular level. So subcellular, smaller than the cell itself. Things like organelles. Again, if you haven't done any anatomy, this is simply, if you like, the organs of the cells. Our cells themselves have different parts that do different things, just like our body does. Even they need to let some things out, some things in. It might be their job to. So in each case, there needs to be selective permeability. Both the wrong things getting through and the right things not getting through are a problem. And this, again, goes all the way up to skin, to the gastrointestinal tract. We want the right things to get in and the right things to get out, and ideally nothing else. Okay, Hallmark 2, also a subset of spatial compartmentalization, keeping everything in its place, is containment of perturbations, or if you like, things that interfere with the function. It's a perturbation. If you were balancing on one leg, let's say, and I gave you a slight push, that would be a perturbation. Our barriers are always going to be challenged. For example, from UVB light from the sun penetrating our skin and causing DNA damage, or noxious substances we breathe when we walk down the road beside traffic. and even the physical stretching of the brain during a concussion, right? So a very physical stressor. We are always experiencing challenges to our barriers. To maintain or restore health, we must be able to quickly heal any such damage. And we also need to be able to isolate and restrict access to any pathogens that penetrate our outer barriers and start sort of getting into the inside in the bloodstream, for example. Just think of a blood clot forming and a scab forming, right? Not only does that stop us bleeding out as part of the healing process, but it stops things coming in, and it keeps things that did come in bound up nicely, or at least that's the ideal. So we need an inflammatory response, but one that is limited to the location and the time period required. We don't want too much inflammation. We don't want it systemic, so we don't want it in the whole system. We don't want it throughout the bloodstream. We don't want to develop an autoimmune response in which our immune system attacks one or more otherwise healthy parts of our own body. So our own mechanisms can go wrong. We need to keep everything in its place. Hallmark 3 is a subset of homeostasis, and it involves recycling and turnover. Our bodies are constantly experiencing wear and tear, right? Everyday wear and tear. Just being alive, moving, digesting, and so on. Breathing is going to create a degree of wear and tear. Our mucosal linings, like those of our gastrointestinal tract, slough off and have to be replaced every few days. Some of the enzymes we use in digestion are lost in our feces, so they need to be replaced. Exercise breaks down protein in muscles, and so on. Right? This requires our bodies to reuse what it can. For example, if proteins are broken down, they're broken down into amino acids. This is talking about this internally, not as a result of digestion. And some of those amino acids will definitely find their way back into new proteins. But many will also be lost. If we lose the entire cell, let's say, from the gastrointestinal lining, from skin coming off, well, that needs to be replaced. So we need to replace the lost amino acids from our diet, lost lipids, and so on as well. If we wish to build extra tissue, we're trying to lay down muscle, or we're just simply healing, then we need more than just the replacement amount. So just to be clear, we don't just need amino acids. You should know by now we need other nutrients as well. I mentioned lipids, but also the micronutrients. Right? We need to replenish that. Hallmark 4, also under homeostasis, is integration of circuits. Now, far from being one entity, we, and other animals, are really a community of trillions of cells that need to coordinate with each other. And they do this in more and in less direct ways. The most direct way is by the nervous system, which is essentially a dedicated two-way communication system. Right? You can think of it like the fiber optic cabling, although it's nowhere near as fast. Then we have the endocrine system, which if you haven't done any physiology, you can think of as the hormone system. Cells in one part of the body put chemical signals into the bloodstream to communicate with other parts of the body. A little bit like communicating by radio. Hallmark 5, again under homeostasis, is or are rhythmic oscillations. Life is full of cycles and rhythms. We have the cycle of day and night, and we have it light and dark, or well, we should, but of course artificial light has severely upset that age-old rhythm, or at least our place, if you like, in it, our synchronicity with it. We have the cycle of the seasons, which is accompanied by changes in the length of the natural light cycle, for example, and temperature as well, as an example. So those are natural rhythms that we live within, but are maybe sometimes excessively protected from these days. But you get the idea. Our bodies also have natural cycles, the most well studied being the circadian or the 24-hour rhythm. You'll hear about the circadian rhythm. You do not have the same physiology in the morning as in the evening. Everything from hormone levels to body temperature fluctuates throughout the day. Now, yes, some of that is in response to what we're doing. When we exercise, we get hotter. If we go out in a hot environment, if we go into a sauna, for example, we get hotter. Yes, but even if we took those sort of things away and kept the external temperature entirely the same throughout the day and had people being not particularly active or very consistently active at a very light level, for example, we would see these temperature fluctuations. Our bodies have an internal master clock, but every cell in our bodies has its own internal clock, and we want to keep those two synchronized, and our body tries to do that. It also tries to keep us synchronized with the external environment. Right? It takes cues from light first and foremost, not the intensity, number one, the color and the angle, but also when we eat, temperature changes, body temperature changes. They all affect these internal clocks. Part of maintaining this vast community of trillions of cells working together is staying in rhythm. And if you've ever experienced jet lag of any kind, then you have some idea of what it feels like. Or shift work, right? Shift work. Jet lag, shift work, anything where you've had to reset by an hour or more. Even daylight savings. Even daylight savings, that 1 hour is enough to send our systems out of whack. And consider that many people live quite a different life over the weekend, and by that I mean they go to bed at a different time, they wake up at a different time than during the week. So the vast majority of people, whether they travel or not, whether they're officially shift workers or not, put themselves in this shift work position. And you probably have noticed that if you're out of your routine, or if your routine is suddenly shifted, even if it's a regular shift, 3 days on, 4 days off kind of shift, it doesn't feel very good, and it's not very good for our system. So that's an aspect of those rhythms. Hallmark 6 moves us into the larger category of response to stress, and the hallmark itself has been called homeostatic resilience. So how good is the individual, are you at returning to equilibrium when this has been challenged, or to that narrow functional range, well, if it is narrow, but within the functional range when you've been shifted out of it or to the extremes. Again, this is what we do, or this is what we try and build, this is what we try and increase with exercise, with cold exposure, with heat exposure, with meditation, with other intentional stresses or relaxers. We're trying to build this homeostatic resilience. There will always be limits to our ability to eliminate stress. Nor would we want to eliminate it entirely, because it would leave us incredibly weak. It would leave our bones weak if they weren't stressed. It would leave our muscles weak if they're not stressed. But of course, high levels of stress beyond our ability to cope with are also problematic. We can either take away the stressor, and if that's not an option, or maybe it is an option, but that's not our preferred option, or we can get stronger. We can build that homeostatic resilience. So the quote that always springs to mind when I look at this is, do not pray for an easy life, pray for the strength to endure a difficult one, which is often attributed to Bruce Lee. This is a variation of it by JFK, but you get the idea. There's less capacity generally to remove stress and more capacity to build resilience. Hallmark 6 is hormetic regulation, nothing to do with hormones. So hormesis is the idea that a small enough amount of a toxin or stressor makes us better at dealing with a larger amount of that toxin, that stressor, right? More broadly, it's the idea that a stressor we're able to recover from adequately makes us stronger. In exercise terms, for example, we stress the system, say the skeletal muscles, or the cardiovascular system, to make them better in some way, stronger, have more endurance, whatever it might be, faster even. But the benefits aren't necessarily restricted to just the target system, and we'll look at this. There's an upside and a downside to things being so interrelated. The upside is that sometimes by improving one thing, you have a positive flow-on effect. The downside is that if there's a problem in one area, it tends to affect others. The key here, when it comes to building homeostatic resilience and using this hormetic regulation, is dose. The dose needs to be challenging, but it needs to be a dose that we can recover from, and then after the recovery, we supercompensate. It's called supercompensation, familiar to the exercise folks out there, hopefully, is that we come back a little bit stronger than before. Of course, the opposite can also happen if we overdo it, for example. So we're almost there. Well done for hanging in so far. We have one more hallmark. Hallmark 8 is also a subset of the stress response and is repair and regeneration. Now that's closely related to recycling and turnover, but in the context of injury or infection or something beyond day-to-day or everyday wear and tear. So no matter how much we build our resilience, we will experience occasional injury, possibly in the pursuit of greater resilience. In fact, as we exercise, for example, we will get an infection every now and then. I mean, if we're extremely resilient, we may barely feel it, but we are being exposed to pathogens all the time, viruses, bacteria, and so on, right? We'll get at least a little bit sick. So if our resilience is high, our recovery is going to be faster than it would otherwise be. And also, the response to the injury, to the infection, is much more likely to be matched to the task and not excessive. Inflammation gets a bad reputation, but is actually necessary for healing. However, too much can cause its own damage. So all of these hallmarks interact. For example, if our barriers are intact, there'll be less strain on homeostasis. Likewise, if we live in tune with our biological rhythms, there will be less stress to deal with overall. I won't say too much about this slide and instead invite you to pause and read it shortly or have a look at it on the handouts. This first image focuses on types of barriers, the common threats to their integrity, and what may happen once their integrity is breached. So pause now and have a read of the graphic for specific examples, or just look at the handout. The next graphic, which I know I'm covering a little bit of, the very bottom one, electrophysical perturbation, is basically heart arrhythmia. Could be other types of arrhythmias, I guess, but we generally think of the heart. Do have a look at the handout. It won't have my face covering it. Basically, this is looking at perturbations. It's not important that you learn these by rote or that you know every term. There may be some unfamiliar terms here. That's fine. These are simply more examples. So pause now, have a closer look if you like. This graphic looks at different levels of organization. At the bottom, we're dealing with the scale of molecules like proteins and DNA. These absolutely can be damaged and need recycling and repair and replacement. In fact, that's happening all the time. The same is true for organelles. You can think of these as the organs of the cells. Not only do they get damaged and therefore need repair or replacement, a cell, just like the whole organism, needs to coordinate internally, and the organelles even need to coordinate with each other. I've already mentioned that cells need to coordinate with each other, and that includes over short and long distances. Just as you sometimes need to talk to a neighbor and sometimes need to communicate with someone much further away. Organs likewise need to coordinate their internal activities, but also need to coordinate with each other. So that's the organ systems level. For example, if you start breathing faster, your heart rate will go up. Or if you start moving more vigorously, your breathing will speed up before there's any great increase in your need for oxygen. It's just these are all coupled together. Last, at least in this model, is the meta-organism. Well, it turns out that along with the human cells that make up our body, we carry around an equal or larger number of microbial cells, depends on what you read. By microbial cells, I mean things like fungi, archaea, protozoa, viruses, bacteria, and so on. These take up residence on our skin, in our airways, and most of all in our bowels, particularly our large intestine. Now, I'm not talking about when you have an infection. I mean all the time. We used to call this collection of bugs our microflora, but the modern and much more accurate term is microbiota. Our microbiota don't just sit there minding their own business. They interact with each other. Again, it's a community, and with us. These interactions are best understood in terms of something called the gut-brain axis, which is basically the two-way communication between our intestines, including the resident microbiota, and our brain, but also our immune system. Now, I'm not saying that there is no interaction with what lives on our skin and our brain or other parts of our body, or no interaction between what's in our airways and other parts of our body. It's just that so far the best studied, and there's still a lot to learn, but is this whole gut-brain axis. So our intestinal microbiota, our enteric nervous system, and our brain, our central nervous system, and our immune system, for example. So there are bacteria that can produce neurotransmitters, that can produce hormones, or that help in the breakdown of hormones. So we may think of ourselves as human. If you've done enough biology, you'll know what a eukaryotic cell is. We might think of ourselves as eukaryotic, but we are in fact more than that. We also contain all these other organisms, and like I say, they're not just there for the ride. There is an interaction, there are benefits, there are detriments, and so on. Let's just briefly revisit rhythms. I've mentioned the circadian rhythm, our roughly 24-hour rhythm that, for example, sees us reach a low in body temperature about 1.5 to 2 hours before our regular wake-up time. Many hormones follow a circadian rhythm. Within that rhythm are shorter rhythms, known as ultradian rhythms. You may have noticed that while you may have one period of being awake and another of being asleep, I'm assuming no naps here, you don't feel equally alert or energetic throughout that waking phase, right? We go through many more phases throughout the day than just those extremes of active and resting. Now, some of that is due to what you do, of course, but some of it is due to these ultradian rhythms, these shorter rhythms. And lastly, we have rhythms that are longer than 24 hours. These are called the infradian rhythms, and they're the most well understood. There is the menstrual cycle, which on average takes place over a 28-day period. Now, I'm sure we will learn about other rhythms in due course, but whenever I look this up, the menstrual cycle is always by far the most prominent. It's the one we understand the best, and it's the one that probably we can relate to the best at this stage. Health, given we have these rhythms, is therefore partly about having a regular set of rhythms, so helping to maintain these rhythms through lifestyle and through a lifestyle that respects, or if you prefer, works with our internal rhythms that also have an overlap with day-night cycle, for example, the external rhythms. Bringing this back to health and disease. Stress can and often does challenge several of these hallmarks of health. Again, don't worry if not every word is familiar. You are more than welcome to read the full paper, get a more in-depth understanding, but it is not required reading by any stretch. So in this model, we have an input, a stressor that might be chosen, like exercise, or an unintended stressor, like an infection or an injury. The response by the body generates an output that either places the system, or likely systems, back into homeostasis, or if things go wrong, actually makes things worse. So consider SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19. Now the virus is by itself damaging. A virus invades cells. Eventually those cells will be killed by the virus or by the immune system trying to fight the virus. But what is sometimes fatal is the excessive inflammatory response by the body. An inflammatory response that continues and gets stronger even after the virus is mostly cleared. So that's just one example that our bodies can basically go too far. Another example would be when fighting off an infection ends up producing an immune response that starts recognizing some part of our body as an invading pathogen and treats it accordingly, which gives us autoimmune disease. So a slightly more nuanced graphic shows how, following a major challenge to homeostasis, we would hope to get recovery and possibly supercompensation, meaning the system becomes stronger than it was before. Or we could get a chronic disease state, which might be stable over a long time, or worse yet, deteriorate. And of course, worst case scenario is if the perturbation is just too overwhelming, we get death. That's certainly, I think we can all agree, the absence of health, no matter how you define it. But let's say we are intentionally challenging homeostasis. So we're employing this principle of hormesis. We might actually build resilience. Now that would certainly be the goal. But again, the result might be no change following recovery, or even a weakening of the system if the stimulus, or if you prefer the stressor, exceeds the capacity to recover. So this is always about matching stress to recovery. So in real world terms, the right type and amount of physical activity would make for stronger bones, stronger muscles, stronger tendons, more coordinated system, and so on. But the wrong type and or amount might lead to stress fractures, to weaker muscles, to tendonitis, to repetitive strain injuries. Right? That's something that springs to mind. So the bad news is that dysfunction in one area can have ripple effects that cause problems upstream. For example, genetic variations can lead to or make us more susceptible to given disease processes. The old adage that genetics loads the gun but environment pulls the trigger applies very well here. One very relevant example of nutrition and physical activity are mutations of the ApoE gene, which affects lipid transport in the blood, but most importantly, you might say, is associated with different risks of developing Alzheimer's disease depending on which gene variant you have. Now, genes also influence the effective dose of exercise. For example, we have research showing that people on average from Southeast Asian descent require more physical activity on average to achieve the same cardiometabolic disease risk reduction, so think heart disease reduction, type 2 diabetes reduction, and so on, as those of European descent. So one group just needs more on average. Not every person in that group is going to be that way. And that's for undoubtedly genetic reasons. Now, of course, the problem might not be in the genes we're born with, so we may not have a protection or predisposition towards something. It may be damage to the genes due to, say, sunburn, which might in the long run lead to tumor formation, or let's say we might be starting at a high level in the structure, say the organelle level, the cell or organ level damage. It can feed down and it can feed up, right? So we're making these divisions, but everything works together. On the other hand, problems can also be top down, right? Such as chronic psychological stress leading to increased permeability of the intestinal lining, right? So things get in that shouldn't, barrier function issues. Again, we see a domino effect. I'm extremely stressed over a long period of time. My bowels get more permeable, all sorts of things get in that shouldn't. This drives up inflammation. That can have an effect on other barriers, such as my blood-brain barrier, and so on. It can create a domino effect, or even a sort of a vicious cycle. Right, so that's all a little bit of bad news, isn't it? The good news is that improvements at one or a few levels by addressing lifestyle factors like diet, like physical activity, but others as well, like sleep, for example, like improving breathing mechanics and biochemistry, stress reduction methods, all of those, they also have up and downstream benefits, and usually far more than a very targeted pharmacotherapy. The medicines clearly have their place. I'm just saying that generally we find many more added benefits with lifestyle modification, right? It improves this and this and this and this other thing. Even if maybe our goal is only to lower cholesterol or only to lower blood pressure. If we're doing it with diet, with physical activity, we're probably going to have a host of other benefits. At its most basic then, good health, or in good health, the systems of our bodies work synchronously. They work together, they support each other, and the person as a whole. So the pursuit of health then is the pursuit of internal harmony. By working with our own natural rhythms, maybe to some extent the rhythms of nature, we move toward health. And if we look at an older model of health, physical, mental, spiritual, like for example yoga, I'm just picking this one because I'm most familiar with it, we can see much of this concept reflected by it, because yoga literally can be translated as meaning to yoke or to bind body, mind, spirit, or if you prefer soul, together, right? In other words, it's about bringing things together, to work together, to create a degree of harmony, including potentially harmony with the external environment, not just harmony in the internal environment. Now, what I've just shown you is, of course, a much more reductionist view. Nonetheless, I hope you can see that it can sit alongside more traditional models. What it offers is a much more measurable set of criteria, so we can understand in more detail what's going on. So I know it's been quite long. I hope it's been enlightening. It's been great to put together and do and think about myself. I think about this sort of thing a lot, but having this kind of structure has really helped. So hope you can take this going forward, not just in this paper, but as you think about health generally in your life and your career.